I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingeast.com, and here today with me is Lynette Zang, founder and CEO of Zang Enterprises. Thank you so much for being here. Great to have you.
I'm very glad to be here, Charlotte. I love you. It's like it's an old friend coming home.
Yes, it's always good to see you in person. I love our chats online, but really good to have you here in person.
Yes.
I think it's the first time since last year. And again, we're catching up at VRIC right here in Vancouver. So we made it to day 2. And I know you were up on stage around the show floor yesterday. So
yes.
I wanted to ask by getting your takeaways from the first day. How is the mood feeling here? I know you're having conversations with your followers all the time. So how's it feeling?
Well, it feels very upbeat, actually. And a lot of new people coming in. I've met a number of brand new people to gold, whether it's mining or the physical. So that is always a really good thing to see that people are starting to pay attention.
Yeah, I think it's a good atmosphere. It feels busier than last year. I have a hard time gauging these things, but that's how it feels. So, and I noticed at VRIC this year, Jay has really put a strong focus on geopolitics in the agenda and in the talks that he's arranging, which makes total sense.
Right.
So I thought to bring that into this conversation as well and ask you what key geopolitical themes you're watching. Of course, there are so many.
Well, you know, we're in the U.S., we're inaugurating a new president.
As we speak.
Right,
yeah,
as we speak. And so that is, I think we're going to have an extraordinarily interesting 4 years. I'll say that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think everybody is kind of like, wow, it's going to be uncertain. It's going to be extraordinary, as you said. So we'll see how that goes. And yeah, that is a big development since our last conversation is we have Donald Trump coming in for his second term. And as we said, Inauguration Day is right now. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But he's made a lot of promises. And one of the big ones that I've been hearing a lot about is the Department of Government Efficiency. So I thought to ask you about that, how that could play out, because a lot of people here are, you know, they like the idea of that. It's just a question of how does that actually play out?
Well, I think we're all going to find out how that plays out. But, and I think it'll, you know, I think everybody is for a smaller government. I'm not quite sure that they can do it without massive disruption. And that's really what I expect to see. And that disruption should cause an awful lot of volatility in the markets. So, which is great for traders. That's what they like, is that volatility. But that's what I expect to see. A lot more inflation, but a lot of volatility as this whole piece transitions, because there's so many unknowns, you know, and as you said, he's made a lot of promises. Well, it's not just up to him. So we'll see what happens.
We'll see. Yeah, and we'll have to have you back maybe in a few months just to give him some time to see what happens. I'm having a lot of that kind of conversation today, as we'll check back in later.
But I will say that what I thought was quite helpful was what happened between Israel and Hamas, and how the outgoing President Biden's emissary and President Trump's emissary really worked together to help make that peace and that ceasefire happen. So that made me feel quite good.
Yeah, that is a great point, and something that we can talk about that's really happening now. So you mentioned the inflation, right? And one thing that we're hearing a lot about with Trump is these tariffs, right? And even this morning, there's news on that. I know we're waiting in Canada, in particular, to see how that plays out. And I read one headline this morning saying, oh, maybe that gets pushed down the road. But yeah, I thought to get your thoughts on tariffs and inflation in 2025, what we can know at this point.
Well, I don't think that they are mutually exclusive. So whether or not he inserts the tariffs at this point, anybody that was coming in had a big spending agenda. And that means a whole lot more debt. And when you're looking at the challenge that the central bank is having with interest rates, right, and having to keep them higher for longer, and the government needing to issue a ton of more debt, plus all the corporate debt that is rolling over or needs to roll over because they can't pay it off in this higher interest rate environment. You know, I don't think it's just tariffs that are going to create more inflation. And I think this inflation has proved a whole lot stickier because of all the money that they printed, right? I mean, that money is still sloshing around in the system. And I think, interestingly enough, at the same time that there's all of this money that they printed really since 2008 and then 2020 sloshing around in the system, there still seems to be a lack of liquidity. So the ability to buy and sell something without majorly moving the prices. So we could not be living in more interesting times. We just couldn't.
Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction is, okay, we've got the tariffs and we've got inflation. This is happening separately on its own, with or without. The other thing I wanted to bring up, and you kind of started, I think, to allude to the debt, right? So we've had these debt ceiling conversations pop right back up. And I think I know what you're going to say, but this happens every so often. We have all this to do about it. Will this time be any different when we're seeing this right now?
It can't be. That's like you going out and spending and putting all of this debt on your credit cards and then going, nah, I'm not going to pay it, right? So it cannot be different this time. And I'm never really worried about whether or not the U.S. can pay its debts, because they could just create more debt to pay the old debt. The problem is, when we're going back to geopolitics, that debt on a global basis is starting to matter more.
Yeah. Okay. And I also want to bring up the Fed in 2025. So this is another place where it's hard to know what's happening. And again, we have Trump, because possibly we're going to have this clash between Trump and Powell. But how do you think the Fed reacts to these circumstances that we see coming?
What I see is a battle royale. And not just between Trump and Powell, but the markets and the Fed, right? Because the Fed wants they really, globally too, the central banks want to lower interest rates because they want to inspire more inflation, right? Because we've got this massive wall of debt, whether it's government or corporate or even individual debt, and we're seeing, the defaults rise pretty significantly. So this is a very dangerous time. I mean, it's extremely dangerous whether you're in the market or you're wondering what to do. And I'm going to tell you, you got to get to safety. And safety is sound money, physical silver, physical gold. And they have different functions. But for me, this is a battle royale. I'm going to the sidelines. I've got my safety net. And that's also food, water, energy security, barterability, wealth preservation, community, and shelter. And since the last time we spoke, I had just started on my community journey with you, right? And we talked about what happened in Australia, where I just threw the materials out and started talking about community. And since then, I've really worked hard. I've traveled quite a bit to develop that global community and a sound money movement, because we've got a new currency that's coming in. And if they have their druthers, it will be a surveillance currency. So we need to come together on a global basis and take that out of the crappy debt-based fiat money that they're inflating away and put it into sound money that is above all governments and above all central banks, because it is used, both of these are used in every single sector of the global economy. And while I always spoke about that, to be truthful with you, there's 8.4 billion people on this planet. And so people sit there and say, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. And that's true. And I can easily say that too. I'm just one person. What can I do? And that's true. But coming together, there's so much more of us than there are of the governments. We need to take our power back, and we need to have a say in the new currency. This is our opportunity, really. It's critical. This is the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I also want to go a little bit further down the path of currencies, because I know you've done so much research on this, very knowledgeable.
Since 1987, I've been studying currency life cycles. So, yeah.
Yeah. So we should ask about what's going to happen to the U.S. dollar moving forward, and then so we've got new currency coming, and maybe we talk about that for people who aren't familiar.
Okay. Well, with the U.S. dollar, and actually, it's not just the U.S. dollar. This is true on a global basis. What's good about the US dollar is that the Federal Reserve on the FRED, F-R-E-D, which is the Federal Reserve Education Department, they post the purchasing power of the US dollar because it is still technically the world reserve currency. But I see something that is happening today, and actually it started in 2008, but if I look on the graph in 2012, we saw a run on the dollar begin. And I say that because both Japan and China, key buyers of our debt, have been selling the debt and not buying more. And that is very similar to the run that we had on the dollar back in the 60s when foreign governments were sending in their dollars and pulling the gold out of our system. So when you have a run on a currency, and this happens to be the world reserve currency, that's not really true anymore. And it hasn't been for a while. But that is a huge shift. And what it tells us is that in the US, while globally everybody's going to go, into a hyperinflationary depression, the US is going to feel that the most because there's just no buyers. And all of this debt that needs to be issued to fund what we've already spent, let alone what they're wanting to spend, and the shift that's coming in. I'm glad I have gold and silver.
Yeah. And of course, this has major implications, I think, for gold and silver prices. Although if you look at it the other way, it's your currency that's being devalued. But I have to ask you, gold and silver prices in 2025, what does all of this mean?
Well, for silver, what I'm seeing is the coming to conclusion on that cup formation. Now, you have to understand that when I'm saying that, I'm really talking about the spot silver and the spot gold market. This is how they've trained us, though, because who refers to that as spot gold or spot silver? They refer to it as gold and silver, but that reflects a trading market. So inside of that, I think that this year I can't guarantee it, but I think we'll come to conclusion on that top. So somewhere in the vicinity of $50. When it breaks above that, then it's anybody's guess as to where the markets will go. It's still way below its true value. And for spot gold, I could see it easily 3,500, maybe even 4,000, because the unknown into a new presidential term with a pretty aggressive president, right? And lots of changes and all of the corporations that are coming in. Well, I'd say the big corporations like Elon Musk's, he's got a bunch, right? And Meta and things like that. That's going to have a huge influence with deregulation, which we're already at leverage levels higher than we were in 2008. But let's add some more debt and more leverage on that. And what's happening with the stress tests that were created after 2008, that was really more about making the public feel like the banks were safe and sound, not really a reality to whether or not the banks are safe and sound. And so they're basically, the central banks, the Federal Reserve, is handing over all of the keys to the kingdom to the banks right now, in an environment where the expectation is a whole lot less regulation. You want to talk about a casino?
Yeah. And so we've talked before about, your preferred ways of getting exposure to physical gold and silver. One question that was occurring to me right now when we're talking about, the banks, how should people think about storing this metal?
Not in the banks.
Exactly.
Not in the banks. But there are, like for me personally, there are a couple of private vaults in Phoenix, which is where I live, and I'm in dead central Phoenix. I could physically walk to either one of those vaults. So you need to be diversified. For those that are not as visible as I am, again, it's the strategy that we execute at Zang Enterprises is built in layers. So there are some of those layers, like the barterable piece, and both of these are barterable. They're just raw metals. Should be held as close to you as possible, as well as your cash. So there are places where you can hide them in your home, like that 2-inch kick plate underneath your kitchen cabinets, and you put in a false floor. And yes, you have to move your pots and pans when you want to access your gold or silver, but people don't hold gold and silver in their homes anymore. So who's going to even think about that? Right? So you have to get a little creative, but we have a whole list of ideas on where you can store your metals. So, but private vaults and then some hidey holes in your home makes a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah, well, and moving your pots and pans, that's a small price to pay, I think, for having a good place to put your gold and silver. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about being prepared for these circumstances that are ahead. And when I was getting ready for this conversation, I was thinking also about these fires in California that we're seeing.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get your opinion on that, because that just adds a whole other element to being prepared.
Well, I can tell you that when I was in my condo and therefore keeping it at my house, you can get fireproof safes, right? But gold is also indestructible. So in any form, gold and silver are monetary at their base, but you're right, it does put another perspective on there that you have to think about. So there are fireproof boxes. There are a number, I had some clients that kept their gold actually buried in the ground, but inside of a PVC pipe that was completely sealed off, so they didn't have to worry about water, they didn't have to worry about fires, right? And they, if you're living on a farm, like a number of my clients had large pieces of property and heavy equipment. So they'd put a huge boulder on top of where they had their gold and silver, and only they could move it with a big, heavy equipment. But that's going to survive a lot of things. And we've seen that. We've seen that in, 1933, people thought, their gold isn't worth anything, right? But remember that somebody bought this property and something looked a little funny over by a tree, and they went in and they started digging, and they found this whole can of gold coins, all different sizes, which this was maybe about 5-7 years ago. At that time, the current market on those coins, especially since they were pre-33, was somewhere north of 10 million, right? Be a lot more now, but that's how they maintain their wealth over time. That's what gold does, and so does silver.
Okay, very, very fascinating. Lots of creative ways, as you said, to go about this. So yeah, and I'm going all along with your tenets, right? I was also thinking about housing. So of course, everybody needs somewhere to live, but I think it's really tough right now, and I think about this because we're in Vancouver, to make the decision to buy a home. So how do you look at that?
I look at it two ways, right? Number one, if it's for speculation, it's severely overvalued, and that will come down. What you need to do is make sure that you own gold to hold your purchasing power so that you have something to work with on the other side of it. But to your point, everybody's got to have a roof over their head, and it isn't just housing to buy a house, it's also rents that are going up at an insane level, right? So part of the strategy is the ability to repay that debt with dollars that have no value, or fiat currency that has no value, which is exactly the same strategy that the government utilizes. It's always repaying the debt with dollars that have less and less and less value, right? So based upon your mortgage, you want a fixed rate mortgage. Right. And I know in parts of the world, you can't, like in the US, you can get a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. You can't always do that in different parts of the world. But if you get a fixed rate mortgage, there is a calculation that we can use to determine, well, how much gold do I need to pay off that mortgage? Because we know what the true fundamental value is. You can't count on Wall Street to do that. But the central banks will do that to get confidence back when they do those overnight revaluations, right? So let's just make life easy and say, okay, right now it might take 10 ounces of gold to pay off that mortgage. Well, by the time that happens, it might take a quarter of an ounce to pay off that mortgage. So you've got to have a place to make your last stand. And as long as you can qualify, which is a big problem for a lot of people, right? But as long as you have the ability to take out a mortgage, you buy enough gold so that you can always, boom, pay that mortgage off just like that, right? Now, historically, 25 ounces of gold buys an entire city block, buildings and all. And that's why I say, like in Venezuela, I think it went up overnight 3,500% when they did that overnight revaluation. Then you just sell the amount of gold you need, you pay off that mortgage, boom, you're done.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And on the note of fixed rate versus variable rate, I know people who those variable rates were hurting in the past several years. So yeah, it makes total sense. All right, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. Always really good to get your thoughts. I would put it over to you before we wrap up. Any final thoughts you would share, especially on the note of community, because I know that's really important to you.
It is very important. The local community, and we're seeing this around the world, the single biggest issue for most people as we go through these transitions is food, right? And you can't live without food and you can't live without water. But community, I've been working, and I mean, do I look like a farmer? But I've been working on building an urban farm since 2008. We don't have that luxury of time. So my mantra, you need to have security in food, water, energy, security itself, barterability, wealth preservation, and that community peace and shelter, because we need to come together and bring whatever gifts or talents that we have. And a good place to start could be at a community garden or even your local farmer's market where you can meet the people that create the food and create a relationship. Go there, volunteer, there's always work to do on a farm. Create that relationship, but do it with a group of people. So in my bug out location on our list, if we need to all leave, we've got doctors, we've got plumbers, we've got farmers, electricians, teachers, right? So you bring all of those skills and talents together, and then you can survive. But on a global basis, since what the governments want to do and the central bankers want to do is install a full surveillance currency, and that way you lose all choices, we've got to have a say. We've got to. And so that's why I've been traveling around the world so much. I have more trips planned for this year. And we've got to create that global community and a global revolution, peaceful, just by converting your government inflation currency into sound money. And if enough of us can do that, we have a shot at having a say in the new monetary system. And if I'm at that table, then what I want is not just what they tell me is backed by gold, but it must be convertible into the gold. We have to have the ability to hold those that are in power. We have to have the ability to hold their toes to the fire. So that's what I'm fighting for.
Okay, well, we'll end it on that note. I always love talking to you because you make it sound so doable and something that we can accomplish. So
we can. And I know that, it's funny, Charlotte, because I used to think, I grew up thinking that I was supposed to do something that had a positive influence on a lot of people. And it's true, I do. But what I've come to understand as I've been learning more and more about community is coming together. We're all rowing in the same direction. That, I'm getting chills. That energy that we can bring to, it is doable. It is doable. Let's do it.
Yeah. Very powerful message. Thank you so much for coming on to talk once again. And thank you also for talking about the Trump situation when we're in such a time of flux. So we'll hope to have you back soon when things are, well, maybe they won't be more certain, but there has more information. Yeah, we'll have more information anyway. So thank you so much. Once again, I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com, and this is Lynette Zang with Zang Enterprises. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so leave us a comment below.